Welcome to Pages and Pods. In this episode, we will follow the life of biblical Joseph as a spiritual journey of initiation. Specifically, we will examine his life within the framework of a hero's journey as outlined by Joseph Campbell, which is the same path as a sun hero described by Rudolf Steiner. I have already produced 2 episodes describing Joseph's life within the context of Jewish history, and they are linked below. Now it's time to look at Joseph the Initiate, following a path set before him by the divine intellect known to the Jews as Hashem, the unknowable creator of reality. Jewish and Christian scholars tend to gloss over the life of Joseph as a fleeting moment in time, as the son of Jacob who opened the door to Egypt during the time of the Great Famine. But in fact, his life in Egypt was one of temptations and personal sacrifices, which led to his initiation as a sun hero who established a cosmic path for the life force of Moses to enter. Joseph established the foundation in Egypt for the tribes of Israel, from which Moses emerged to speak the divine words of the Creator, which ultimately shaped the Western world as we know it today. To refresh our memory, here's a brief synopsis of Joseph's life as described in the Torah. He is sold into slavery by his jealous brothers, sold again as a slave to a prominent Egyptian priest, and then thrown into jail with false charges by the priest's wife, whose advances he scorned. But all along the way, he managed to raise himself out of despair and into positions of authority. He convinced Pharaoh to allow his brothers to settle in southern Egypt and returned the body of his father Jacob to Canaan after his death. Though his story is remarkable and demonstrates great personal strength and perseverance, this story obscures Joseph's divine mission within the context of the evolution of the spiritual consciousness taking place in the Egypto-Chaldean period as described by Rudolf Steiner. So let's examine his story in the framework of the hero's journey and see it through our own spiritual cognition and even through the eyes of Pharaoh. I recently read a book by Nobel Prize-winning author Thomas Mann titled Joseph in Egypt. He used a clairvoyant sense similar to the one described by Steiner to write about the personal details in Joseph's life. Thomas Mann gives us a mental image of Joseph as he travels with a slave trader who purchased him from his brothers for 20 pieces of silver. Joseph, who had no end of self-confidence, is in deep intellectual banter with his master and is resolute that the pancake he made for his master was like no other in the world. During the parley, the master discovers that Joseph can read, write, and calculate arithmetic. He's impressed with this young man he just bought. So he puts him in charge of the inventory of his caravan. And he also asks that Joseph continued making pancakes. This is quite a remarkable story from Thomas Mann. It's just part of 2 volumes of Joseph's life. But when you read this novel or spiritually inspired insight, the true nature of Joseph, the person, the human being, the man of feelings and insecurities and intellect comes through. And what we discover during this discussion between Joseph and his master is that from Joseph's honesty and forthrightness, he gains respect and has been elevated from just a common slave who was destined to be sold in the brothels of Heliopolis, an insight we learn from rabbinic midrash as written in the Me'om Loetz, which I've covered in a separate podcast. Joseph is now in charge of the inventory of the caravan. He has crossed the first threshold in this hero's journey, and has proved himself capable of directing his own destiny. Look into your own inspirational thoughts about Joseph. Interact with your spiritual mind and imagination and see this young man, only 17 years old, cast into the wilderness as a slave with nothing but personal charm, literary and mathematical skills, and the unproven wisdom of the greatest spiritual leaders of the Babylonian world. But his only chance of survival is to stay connected to the memories of his father and his spiritual devotion to an unknowable God. Returning to the story by Thomas Mann, the caravan continues its journey across the Sinai, where they encounter a lonely outpost called the Fort of Thel in the middle of the swamplands. This is the guarded entrance to the land of Egypt. The guards repeatedly tell Joseph's master to turn back. They threaten to kill the wretched sand rabbits of the desert. But the master has prepared his caravan. He has ordered them to bathe, put sweet oil in their hair, and paint their faces, as was the custom of the Egyptians. He gave the name of Potiphar as his Egyptian contact and described his credentials as an experienced trader. The guards tell him that their leader is away and will not return for several days, so the master makes camp outside the fort and waited patiently for the leader of the fort to return. Joseph stays silent and makes mental notes of everything, and most importantly, he has come to learn that to be in Egypt, you had to be accepted by the Egyptians. Finally, the fort commander returns and is impressed by the master's story. The caravan is allowed to pass, and the master moves around southern Egypt to trade goods in other markets. When they reach Heliopolis, Joseph is sold to Potiphar, who in some texts is described as the local master of the guard, but in Midrashic texts, which I will call the rabbinic memory, he is both a bureaucrat or a priest. Joseph is recognized as an intelligent, literate servant. The master makes a nice profit on the deal, better than he would have received had he sold Joseph into brothels. As for Joseph, his journey has positioned him in the house of the elite class of Heliopolis. The life and initiatory process of the priests of Heliopolis is described in detail in a book titled Her-Bak, meaning The Face of Horus, by Isha Schwaller de Lubitz. From my research, I've concluded that Potiphar had duties within the administration of the priesthood. However, he may have been on his own spiritual path, which would lead him into the initiatory gateway of the high priests of the sun god, Atum-Ra. Potiphar's marriage to his chief wife, who Thomas Mann names Mut-em-Enet, commonly called Mut, was an arranged marriage. The name Mut is associated with the mother goddess of everything in the world. Her name, Mut-em-Enet, translates as one who is with the mother goddess. She was the daughter of a local princeling, the head of a nome or province in Egypt. As the wife of a priest, she was obligated and obliged to be a member of the Order of Hathor, a woman's league in Heliopolis. Hathor was a goddess whose attributes were beauty, joy, and promiscuity. Mut rose to the highest position in the women's league, that of wife of Ammon. Within the league, she wore a headdress of cow's horns and a sun disk to show her position as a human representation of a goddess of Eros and fertility. Her position fits well with her relentless pursuit of Joseph. There was little to no intimacy between her and her husband except for procreation, and Joseph was a handsome man. Her relationship with Potiphar was made even more platonic after his castration. Rabbinic memory tells us that Potiphar was castrated by an angel because he also had desires for Joseph. However, it's possible that Potiphar also wanted to become an initiate into the inner circle of the solar priests of Heliopolis. It was not uncommon for an initiate to castrate himself to demonstrate his rejection of worldly passions. As for Mut, the rabbis tell us that she had a vision that Joseph would bring her powerful children, offspring that she thought would be her own. Now that we understand the dynamics of Potiphar's house, it's easy to see how Joseph would learn about Egyptian high society, the religious practices of the priesthood, and the customs of the elite. Potiphar made him master of the house, which would require Joseph to assume the outward appearance of an Egyptian. Joseph's next rite of passage through the threshold of initiation came when he refused Mut's relentless attempts at an affair. Though some claim that a liaison with Mut would have given him great authority, he would have certainly been put to death if the affair had been made public. After a year of rejection, Mut turned her scorn into false accusations of attempted rape and forced Potiphar to cast judgment against Joseph. But Potiphar knew his wife. He knew the accusation was false, but had to pacify Mut and her entourage of noble women who felt she needed to be avenged. Being a priest, he may have also had a sense about Joseph, of his own divine connection. Potiphar did not have Joseph killed or sent to a regular prison where he would have certainly died, but instead sent Joseph to the royal prison as a prisoner slave of Pharaoh. Potiphar also personally knew the head guard of the royal prison and gave him notice that Joseph was only guilty of circumstances, not crimes, and was a talented and trusted servant who had managed his house. By staying true to the moral values taught to him by his father Jacob, and particular to not commit adultery, Joseph passed through the next threshold. Though his hero's journey landed him in prison, it would eventually lead him to the court of Pharaoh. While in prison, he rose to the highest position a prisoner could attain, the master of the prisoners. The warden placed him in charge of seeing that all the prisoners were clothed and fed, as well as to assist in any personal matters of the prisoner. He spent 12 years in the royal prison. The situation must have felt hopeless. But then one day, 2 prisoners confided their dreams to him, and his discernment came to pass. He told one of the prisoners, an attendant of Pharaoh, that he would be released, and the other prisoner, a baker, that he'd be put to death. On returning to service to Pharaoh, the servant spoke highly of Joseph, so much so that Pharaoh summoned Joseph to interpret his dreams. Though the rabbinic memories don't speak of Joseph's clairvoyance, his ability to interpret dreams was probably already well established. Why else would the butler and the baker have gone to Joseph to explain their dreams? He had shown signs of being gifted since his youth. Jacob shared his deepest teachings with him as a child and even given him private instructions. It was his dreams that got him in trouble with his brothers. Now, at 30 years old, he had to present himself as a clairvoyant to Pharaoh. Maybe age has something to do with his initiation. You know, Buddha was 29 when he left on his journey to enlightenment. Christ was 30. I don't know. I'm just saying. Something about the age. Coming before Pharaoh was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and if all went well, Joseph would be freed from prison, but there was a catch. He had to face Pharaoh as a true Egyptian, shaved, perfumed, made up, and clothed in Egyptian garments. What's more, he would have to bow down to Pharaoh as the representation of Horus on earth, as if he was God. Rabbinic memory says that he could bow down to authority to protect his own life. However, there are 3 unforgivable sins a Jew must not do: murder, idolatry, and adultery. We are told that Joseph, being true to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, kept God in his heart as he bowed. He never let go of his dedication to the God of his fathers. As you internalize Joseph's journey, his dedication to truthfulness, his refusal to commit adultery, and his ability to control his emotions, you can sense that the rabbinic understanding is true. But if you take time to understand the Pharaonic mind, and I have podcasts about this, you will also know that to be Pharaoh was to have divine connection to the one true creator. In fact, to be a true Pharaoh was to be an initiate of the solar god. As a rite of passage, pharaohs had to symbolically, if not actually, offer a portion of his soul to Atum Ra in exchange to house the spirit of the divine in the form of Horus. An interesting unspoken acknowledgement of status may have occurred between Pharaoh and Joseph, something that was unseen by his court, though perhaps felt by the priest initiates of the unseen god of Heliopolis. What's more, rabbinic memory places Joseph's time in Egypt during the reign of Amos I, a pharaoh who was a true initiate of the solar god, the unseen, unknowable god of Egypt, known to those who were the true initiates, the high priests and the pharaohs who possessed the innate and inherited clairvoyance still active in, as Rudolf Steiner described, the Egypto-Chaldean period of Earth's spiritual history. Archaeologists have discovered the intensity to which Amos I dedicated himself to Atum Ra, the solar creator. He restored and endowed temples to Ra after expelling the invading Canaanite rulers known as the Hyksos. He expanded the temples to Atum Ra in Karnak, and he commissioned inscriptions and steles proclaiming his dedication to Ra. The divine intuition of Pharaoh Amos I knew that the God residing in Joseph's heart was the same true God, creator of all reality, who resided in his own soul. The man standing before Pharaoh, the 30-year-old slave born in the lands to the east, was more than a clever interpreter of dreams, but a true initiate of the Creator. Joseph's lesson at the fort of Del and the knowledge he learned in the House of Potiphar had prepared him for this moment, and he presented himself as the penultimate Egyptian, with one exception. His heart stayed true to the God of his fathers. But that day, something else was happening in Pharaoh's court, an event taking place in the spiritual plane. I believe that the moment Joseph bowed before Pharaoh, he was transformed from a Hebrew slave to a son of Pharaoh. In his submission to the authority of Pharaoh, he became Egyptian and entered into Pharaoh's cosmological world. This is not to say he lost connection with the God of Jacob, but he gained a spiritual, intuitive relationship with the face of the creator known as Atum Ra. When you look at the full Kabbalistic picture, isn't Atum Ra an emanation of the same unknowable Ein Sof from which everything, including all spiritual hierarchies, descend into human perception? Going forward, he would rise to become a princeling of Egypt. Initiation demands sacrifice. Those who stay true to the hero's journey are forever changed. The angelic keepers of the threshold, those who granted his passage to a respected clairvoyant, turned over their position to Anubis, the Egyptian guardian of the gates of initiation. Though his heart stayed true to the God of Jacob, his journey was now in the hands of Atum Ra. Moreover, rabbinic memory also recalls that Og, the last of the Rephaim, the giants who terrorized the land before the great flood, was also at Pharaoh's court and pleaded with Pharaoh to dismiss, if not kill, Joseph. But Pharaoh knew better. He felt the presence of the unknowable divine inside of Joseph and elevated him out of prison and made him master of the granaries. He gave Joseph the Egyptian name Zaphenath Paneh, which to Pharaoh meant God speaks and he lives, conveying the divine authority residing in Joseph. Enter into the Pharaoh's mind. What did he see in Joseph to grant him so much authority? He brought Joseph into his court. He elevated him above the other princelings of Egypt. Did he not also invite Joseph into the cosmological sphere of Egyptian divinity? Rabbinic memory claims that Joseph became vizier of Egypt, second only to Pharaoh. But your intuitive sense will tell you that he became no less than a princeling, like Mut's father. He would go on to control the nome or province around Goshen and Heliopolis. He would command a personal army and fight wars against the Midianites from Canaan. During the time of the famine, he would dispossess all but the priesthood of their land in exchange for grain and eventually place them into indentured servitude to Pharaoh. That's right, unlike other Egyptian governors serving Pharaoh, he turned over every acquisition to Pharaoh, an act that opened the heart of the son of Horus to Joseph. If you can feel the relationship that was growing between Pharaoh and Joseph, then you know that Joseph was more than a trusted servant. He was a confidant, a fellow initiate, preserving the unity and harmony of Egypt side by side with Pharaoh. Eventually, the time had come for Joseph to take a wife. Even though he was not a true Egyptian, the eligible noblewomen came out to greet him. He was still a handsome and charismatic man, as well as the most powerful man in the province. He had Pharaoh's blessing to marry into any of the great houses of Heliopolis, and perhaps all of Egypt, but he knew intuitively that this was not his destiny. Rabbinic memory says that he married Asenath, the adopted daughter of Potiphar and Mut. They claim Asenath was the daughter of Dinah from the rape by Shechem and brought to Egypt by an angel, a memory that requires accepting divine teleportation. But other rabbis remember Asenath as the actual daughter of Mut. The problem with oral tradition is that it's difficult to transmit an accurate story over 1,000 or more years. What we know for sure is that Joseph would have known Asenath during his time as master of the House of Potiphar. It's likely that Potiphar was now a priest of the inner temple of the sun, implied by his castration. As father-in-law, Potiphar, now known as Potipharah, would have been a valuable ally in Joseph's leadership. Asenath would have been trained in the traditions of the order of Hathor, who was also known as a powerful mother goddess of Egypt. Her mother would have quietly slipped into the background to avoid any confrontation with Joseph and enjoy the accolades of being the mother-in-law of the great governor. With Asenath, there would be no secrets or duplicity, only an amazing elevation of her social status and perhaps even true love for the new couple. For Joseph, the marriage firmly established his social position as the son-in-law of an initiate of the inner temple and a descendant through marriage of the princelings of the family of Mut. Joseph had transformed his countenance as an Egyptian so much that even his brothers did not recognize him. From the ruse he played on his brothers to learn of their intentions on entering Egypt, speak of his actual power in Heliopolis. He controlled every gate, every road, and every source of grain in the city, one of the greatest cities in Egypt. He even had informants everywhere, at every corner and every gate. Joseph's power and authority in Egypt is made clear when he meets his father Jacob and his brothers as the entire family entered into Egypt. There would be no fort of Tel and uneducated, illiterate soldiers to heckle the tribes of Israel at a border crossing. Instead, Joseph rode out to greet his father in a chariot surrounded by his army and the nobles of Heliopolis. So great was Joseph's procession that Jacob feared for the lives of his sons. Expecting the worst, Jacob knelt down before the coming procession. When Joseph saw his father kneeling, he dismounted his chariot and ran to his father. Though rabbinic memory says that God punished Joseph for his hubris by shortening his life to only 110 years instead of 120, you may ask yourself, what else could a prince of Egypt have done? He had publicly acknowledged his heritage to this small band of Hebrew shepherds, which caused rumors amongst the nobles. With Jacob and his brothers safely inside of Egypt, it was time for Joseph to organize Israel. Joseph had to settle his brothers safely in Egypt and was faced with the task of helping his brother Judah purchase a building for a school to perpetuate the body of rituals handed down to Abraham from the school of Eber and Shem. With Pharaoh's permission, Joseph granted large tracts of grazing land to Israel. And for clarification, I mean the sons of Jacob, who were given the name Israel by an angel of God. This was done as a grant of grazing rights. Egyptians, except for the priests, had been dispossessed of their land during the famine. Even Pharaoh would have been hard-pressed about giving land to foreigners. Another problem came with the school. Jacob wanted to buy the land, which was not something a non-Egyptian could do. It was probably impossible for Joseph, son-in-law of a high priest, to buy the land for the teaching of a non-Egyptian religion. I don't think we need spiritual science for this, just common sense. Although Jacob sent Judah, a talented businessman, to buy the property, it could only have been done with the help of Joseph and the approval of Pharaoh. Joseph must have provided Judah with a document with his personal seal authorizing a sale. Settling his brothers and purchasing a school building were already monumental tasks, even for a princeling. But now there was another hurdle for the settlement of Israel, an acknowledgement of the religion. Joseph succeeded in ordaining a priesthood for Israel, making the worship of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob legitimate in Egypt. We have no record of the details, but it must have required the blessing of Pharaoh and the Egyptian priesthood, if not Adam Ra himself. It may have been that Amos the first saw the same divine light in Jacob as he saw in Joseph. It may have been a practical matter in having a religious, moral, and ethical structure governing the non-Egyptian Israelite tribes. Regardless of the premise, this single act made it possible for the cosmology of Israel to survive and thrive in Egypt. It also exempted the priest class of the Levites from providing labor to Pharaoh, a fact that would preserve the religion of Israel from future despots. Returning to the Levites, Joseph knew from his intuition that his brother Levi had the most intuition and spirituality amongst his brothers, so he gave the priesthood to Levi and his sons. Joseph's last greatest challenge came as a request by his father Jacob. He took an oath to return Jacob's body to Canaan after his death. It was an oath poorly received by the new Pharaoh, Amenhotep I. Fortunately for Joseph, Amenhotep I was a devotee to Amun-Ra and, like his father, was enamored by Joseph. For all of his trials, Joseph's sacrifices would be rewarded. First came from the blessing of his sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. Jacob received them as if they were his own sons and gave them each a portion of Israel's inheritance. They were both to become founders of their own tribe. In this way, Joseph received a double portion of Israel as his sons would now be tribes in their own right. Joseph was second to Pharaoh in bringing stability to Egypt. Rabbinic memory says that when Joseph told Pharaoh that he must leave Egypt to bury Jacob in Canaan, that Pharaoh feared that he would leave and never return. The rabbinic story also says that Joseph blackmailed Pharaoh by threatening to expose him as inferior, but I doubt this story. It works with the rabbinic narrative, but it doesn't credit Pharaoh for having the authorities to simply kill Joseph on the spot. It also neglects Pharaoh's intuitive connection with Zaphenath-Paneah, the Egyptian initiate standing in his court. Joseph also understood that leaving Egypt would invite war and other hardships on his people. They knew each other's mind. Joseph renewed his vows of fealty to Pharaoh, and whose only concern was that Joseph may be killed on the journey. So he gave him an entourage of his most fierce soldiers. Joseph assured Pharaoh that he would proclaim the might of Pharaoh and Egypt to any brigands who blocked their way. Joseph died 54 years after his father, long enough to steward Israel through a succession of 6 pharaohs. He probably died during the reign of Thutmose III, another pharaoh deeply devoted to Amun-Ra. Pharaoh knew of the great power of Joseph, the initiate who brought harmony to Egypt during the reign of his grandfathers. However, as Joseph grew old, he desired that his body be returned to the grave of his ancestors. This terrified Pharaoh and the priests, who knew that the light of Amun-Ra and the blessings of Ma'at lived inside of him. They mummified his body, placed it in a lead coffin, and submerged it into a secret place on the banks of the Nile to prevent his family from taking him out of Egypt. In their mind, even after death, Joseph would bring fortune to Egypt. However, later, Moses would fulfill the wish of Joseph by using his personal connection to the divine to raise the lead coffin out of the Nile and return the bones of Joseph to the resting place of his forefathers. In a spiritual sense, removing Joseph's presence from Egypt set the land and its pharaohs on a new trajectory. Egypt was entering the end of the Egypto-Chaldean era. The inherent intuitive connection of the solar god was diminishing, and future pharaohs were placing their egos above the divine solar god. Such was the case of Ramses, erecting massive statues of himself throughout Egypt. The balance of Ma'at was being overturned, and the beginning transformation would start with a man named Moses. So, like many ancient heroes of the past, Joseph completed his hero's journey back to the land from which he came. This concludes my interpretation of the life of Joseph in Egypt and his hero's journey as a sun hero of the Ein Sof during the time of the highest level of spiritual enlightenment in Egypt. I'm thrilled if you made it to the end. It took me weeks of introspection and reading to see this picture clearly. Help keep me motivated by pressing down on the like icon. And if you haven't done so already, subscribe to my channel. Also, I've strongly challenged the prevailing narrative about Joseph, and I want to know what you think. Leave a comment. I need to know what your opinion is.